A rifleman settles into the bottom of a frozen foxhole somewhere near the German border, December 1944. Before he pulls his blanket around himself, he does something that looks almost tender. He unbuttons his field jacket, reaches inside his shirt, and pulls a pair of wool socks off his bare chest, where they've been pressed flat against his skin all day, like something precious. He swaps them for the soaking pair on his feet. Then he flattens the wet socks against his chest, buttons everything back up over them, and closes his eyes. All around him, up and down the line, hundreds of other men are doing exactly the same thing. Not because anyone ordered it that night, but because by the winter of 1944, every infantryman in Europe understood a brutal piece of arithmetic. The pair of socks drying against your heart was the difference between staying a soldier and leaving the war on a stretcher, feet first. Today we're opening the file on the strangest piece of survival equipment of the Second World War, a spare pair of wool socks, and the nightly ritual that grew around it. The trench foot epidemic that quietly gutted American rifle companies in the fall and winter of 1944, taking more men out of the line in some stretches than German bullets did. The boots that failed, the overshoes that never arrived, and the supply decision made during the race across France that the infantry paid for with their feet. The generals who turned sock-changing into a command obsession, and the buddy rituals, men rubbing each other's bare feet in frozen holes that no training film ever showed. None of it looks like war. All of it decided who was still standing when the Germans came through the Ardennes. Before we climb into the foxhole, do us a quick favor. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It helps the channel more than you know. To understand why grown men slept with laundry pressed against their skin, you have to understand the enemy that made it necessary. Because it wasn't the Wehrmacht. It was water and temperatures just above freezing. Trench foot is what happens to a human foot that stays cold and wet for days at a time. It doesn't require ice. It doesn't require frostbite temperatures. It happens most efficiently in exactly the weather Northern Europe serves up from October to March. Rain, mud, slush, and air hovering in the 30s and 40s. The mechanism is quiet and merciless. Cold, wet skin constricts the blood vessels in the foot. Circulation slows to a trickle. Starved of blood, the tissue begins to die. Slowly, from the outside in. For the first day or two, a man might feel almost nothing, because the same process that kills the tissue kills the sensation. The foot goes numb, then swells. Men describe taking off a boot after days in a flooded hole and seeing a foot that didn't look like theirs, white and waxy, or gray, or an angry mottled purple, sometimes swollen so badly the boot wouldn't go back on. And that was the trap. The man who couldn't get his boot back on was done as a soldier, whether or not he ever heard a shot fired. In the bad cases, blisters and open sores followed, then infection, then gangrene. Army doctors that winter performed amputations on men who had never seen a German. And even the survivable cases broke units because of what recovery actually looked like. A trench foot casualty didn't get a bandage and a day off. He went back down the evacuation chain, aid station, clearing station, evacuation hospital, sometimes all the way to England. And then he lay there for weeks while the circulation in his feet crept back. The recovering stage was its own ordeal. As sensation returned, so did pain, and men who had felt nothing in the foxhole now couldn't bear the weight of a bedsheet on their toes. Ward after ward that winter filled with infantrymen lying with their feet exposed and elevated, waiting to find out how much of them was coming back. Many trench foot casualties never returned to the infantry at all. The reclassified men went to limited duty, driving trucks and guarding depots on feet that could no longer march. And some men described feet that ached in the cold for the rest of their lives, a 30-second weather forecast built into their own bodies, 60 years after Belgium. Now, multiply that by an army. The fall of 1944 put hundreds of thousands of American infantrymen into the wettest European autumn in years, in flooded foxholes along the German border, in the freezing mud of Lorraine, in the drowned forests of the Hurtgen. Then came the coldest winter Northwest Europe had seen in decades. The result was one of the quietest disasters in American military history. Cold injury, trench foot, and frostbite together took tens of thousands of American soldiers out of the line that fall and winter. Commonly cited figures for the European theater run well past 40,000 hospital admissions. Think about what that number means. That is the rifle strength of multiple infantry divisions, removed from the war not by artillery, not by machine guns, but by wet socks. Frontline units felt it worst because trench foot didn't strike evenly across the Army. It concentrated almost entirely in the men who lived in holes in the ground, the riflemen, the machine gunners, the forward observers. The men the Army could least afford to lose, and at the exact moment the infantry divisions were scraping for replacements, entire companies were losing more men to their own feet than to the enemy in front of them. Here's the bitter part. The Army knew. This wasn't a new disease. The name itself, trench foot, came from the First World War, and the story of how that war beat it is the story the armies of 1944 had on their shelves and failed to reread in time. In the flooded trenches of France and Flanders, from the winter of 1914 onward, trench foot had savaged every army on the line. British medical services alone recorded tens of thousands of cases in the war's first winters, and men in the worst sectors stood knee-deep in water for days. And the British, through brutal trial and error, worked out a prevention system that dropped the numbers dramatically. It had 3 parts, and every part of it will sound familiar. First, dry socks, changed on a schedule. Units rotated fresh socks forward with the rations, and in some battalions a man drew his sock ration as reliably as his rum. Second, inspection and accountability. Officers were made responsible for their men's feet, required to inspect them regularly, and answerable up the chain when trench foot rates climbed, because the British had discovered the disease's strangest property. Its rate in a unit tracked the quality of its leadership almost perfectly. Careless battalion, ruined feet. Disciplined battalion, next to none, same trench, same water. And third, the era's signature touch, grease. Men rubbed their feet with whale oil. The British Army went through it by the barrel, coating the skin as a crude moisture barrier before pulling dry socks over it. Primitive, greasy, and effective. By the later years of that war, trench foot in well-run units had gone from epidemic to rarity. All of it was written down. All of it lived in the medical histories and the field service regulations, a complete working answer to cold wet injury tested on 1 million men, a quarter century before D-Day. Which is what makes the winter of 1944 so damning. The American Army didn't lack the knowledge. It lacked the socks, the boots, and in the crucial early months, the command attention. What failed in 1944 was everything between the knowledge and the foxhole. Start with the boots. The standard American combat footwear for much of the campaign was a leather boot, and leather, whatever you treat it with, soaks through when a man stands in water for days. The Army had better answers in the pipeline. Heavily improved winter footwear, including the rubber-bottomed shoe pack that actually kept water out. But the improved gear arrived late, in insufficient numbers, and often reached the rear echelons before it reached the rifle companies. Rubber overshoes, the humble galosh that could have saved thousands of feet, were in chronically short supply at the front that fall, and many infantrymen had discarded them anyway during the summer race across France, when the weather was dry and every pound mattered. And behind all of it sat a supply decision that made a kind of cruel sense at the time. In the late summer of 1944, after the breakout from Normandy, the Allied armies were chasing a collapsing German front across France, and the supply lines stretched to breaking. Every truck, every gallon of gas, every ton of cargo space had to be rationed, and the priority went to the things that kept the pursuit moving: fuel and ammunition. Winter clothing was the bet the logisticians made against the calendar. The war might be over before the cold arrived, and if it wasn't, there'd be time to catch up. The Germans didn't collapse. The rains came early. And the bill for that bet was delivered that winter, paid out one ruined foot at a time. And the ground itself conspired. The war of late 1944 was not the war of the summer, the sweeping tank columns, the liberated towns, the 40-mile days. By October, the front had congealed against the German border, and the American infantry found itself fighting something their fathers would have recognized instantly: a static war in holes, in the rain. In Lorraine, Third Army's fall offensive slogged through some of the worst flooding the region had seen in years. Men crossed fields that had become shallow lakes, and a foxhole dug at dusk had a foot of water in it by midnight. In the Hurtgen forest, the fight went on for months under a dripping canopy of shattered firs, in cold mud that never dried because the sun never reached it. Veterans of that forest talked about the wet as a permanent condition of existence, like the shell fire. Along the flooded Rower Plain, entire battalions lived below the waterline of the fields around them. This was the cruel joke of the campaign's geography. The mobile, mechanized war the American Army had built itself to fight had stopped precisely at the onset of the wettest season in some of the wettest terrain in Western Europe. And the moment a war stops moving, it becomes a war of holes. The First World War's conditions had come back almost to the letter. The First World War's disease came back with them, on schedule, within weeks. So the official system had failed at the exact point where it mattered, the 18 inches between a rifleman's boots and the water he lived in. Which meant the problem got solved the way infantry problems always get solved when the system fails: by the men, with what they had. And what they had was wool socks and their own body heat. The ritual was almost universal by midwinter, and it worked like this. Every man tried to own at least 2 pairs of wool socks, the pair on his feet, and the spare pair inside his shirt, laid flat against his chest or looped over his shoulders under his uniform. During the day, his body heat slowly baked the moisture out of the spare pair, because in a frozen foxhole on a static front, a GI's own torso was the only reliable source of drying heat in his entire world. He couldn't light a fire. Fires drew mortars. He couldn't hang laundry. He lived in a hole. But the human body runs at 98.6 degrees around the clock, free of charge, and pressed flat against the skin of a man's chest, a damp pair of wool socks would go from wet to merely damp to dry over a day of marching and digging and shivering. At night, or whenever the situation allowed, came the swap: dry socks from the chest onto the feet, wet socks from the feet onto the chest. Then massage the feet until feeling came back, work the toes, get the blood moving, put the boots back on. Sleep, repeat tomorrow, every day for a whole winter. And here's the material science that made the whole system work, because the sock itself mattered as much as the ritual. Wool is one of the great survival fibers, and the men of 1944 were carrying it for reasons their grandmothers could have explained. Wool insulates even when it's damp, unlike cotton, which collapses when wet and wicks heat away from the skin so aggressively that cold-weather soldiers in every era have learned the same grim rule: cotton kills. Wool fibers are crimped and springy, trapping air even under the crush of a boot. They absorb a remarkable amount of moisture into the fiber itself while still feeling relatively dry against the skin. And a wool sock, wrung out and pressed against a warm chest, releases that moisture steadily instead of holding it against the foot. A GI with 2 pairs of wool socks and the discipline to rotate them was running a functioning moisture management system with a total equipment cost of about 50 cents. A GI with 1 pair, or with cotton, or without the discipline, was running an experiment on how long his feet could survive in a bucket of ice water. The results of that experiment filled the hospitals. The Army, to its credit, figured out mid-crisis that the sock ritual was the war winner, and the way it responded tells you everything about how seriously the brass came to take a piece of clothing that weighed 3 ounces. Foot care stopped being framed as personal hygiene and became a command responsibility, meaning officers were answerable for the state of their men's feet. Daily foot inspections became standing procedure in unit after unit, sergeants and lieutenants ordering men to strip off boots and socks in the freezing cold, checking each man's bare feet with a flashlight for the white, the waxy, the numb. Third Army under General Patton became famous for its foot discipline. Patton hammered at his commanders that trench foot was a leadership failure, and Third Army worked to push dry socks forward to the foxholes with the same logistical machinery that moved rations and ammunition. Picture that supply chain for a second. Trucks and jeeps grinding through the Ardennes snow, carrying, alongside the K-rations and the .30 caliber, bundles of clean, dry wool socks exchanged at the chow line for the wet pairs, which went to the rear to be washed, dried, and cycled forward again to another man's feet. An entire Army-level laundry rotation running under artillery fire because the alternative was losing a division a month to water. Some units went further and made the buddy system official. You didn't just check your own feet. Numb feet lie to their owner. That's the whole treachery of trench foot. You checked your foxhole buddies. Veterans of that winter described a scene that no recruiting poster would ever touch. Two riflemen in the bottom of a frozen hole, one with his bare feet shoved under the other man's jacket against his stomach, while his buddy rubbed the circulation back into them. And then they'd switch. Men warming each other's feet with their own bodies because that was the equipment available. It looked absurd. It was absurd. It also kept rifle companies existing as rifle companies through the coldest winter of the war. And the men who did it, gruff 19-year-olds who would have died of embarrassment doing anything like it back home, did it nightly, matter-of-factly, because the arithmetic was undeniable. Your buddy's feet were your problem. If his feet died, you were alone in the hole. Put yourself there for one full night, because this is what the sock ritual actually cost. You are 20 years old in a two-man hole on the edge of a Belgian tree line in January 1945. The temperature has been below freezing for 2 weeks, and there is a crust of old snow on the lip of the hole. Your feet have been wet since November. Not soaked, not tonight, but never entirely dry either, because nothing in your world is entirely dry. It is your turn to sleep first. Before you do, you go through the drill you've done so many nights it has stopped feeling strange. Boots off, one at a time, never both at once, in case the shelling starts. Wet socks peeled away, and 2 minutes of rubbing your own feet in the dark, waiting for the ache that tells you the blood still moves. The ache comes. The ache is good news. You reach into your shirt for the pair that's been riding against your chest since yesterday. Warm as fresh bread, and pulling them on is... You will tell people this decades from now, and they won't understand. One of the finest physical sensations you have ever experienced. Dry wool on ruined feet in a hole in Belgium with the war rumbling somewhere north. The wet pair goes flat against your chest, cold as a dead fish for the first 10 minutes, then slowly warming. Boots back on, blanket up, and as you drift off, you can hear your buddy starting his own rotation, the small sounds of a man handling wool in the dark. The quietest weapons maintenance of the Second World War. There was one more dimension to the trench foot war, and it's the darkest one, so we'll handle it the way the Army had to. When a condition can take a man out of a frozen foxhole and put him in a warm hospital bed for 2 months, and when that condition can be produced by simply doing nothing, by not changing socks, not massaging feet, not reporting the numbness until it was too late, then somewhere, some cold and exhausted men are going to do the math. Commanders that winter worried openly about it, and the Army's response made the stakes explicit. Trench foot in some commands was treated not as bad luck, but as a disciplinary matter, evidence of neglect, the soldiers or his officers. Whether any individual man let his feet go on purpose is unknowable, and, honestly, not ours to judge from a warm room 80 years later. What the policy tells you is how desperate the situation had become, an army so hemorrhaged by water and cold that it had to make ruined feet a punishable offense. The sock against the chest wasn't just hygiene. In the winter of 1944, it was very nearly a legal obligation. Step back and look at what this whole story actually is, because it's easy to file it under quaint hardship and miss the point. The largest, richest, most mechanized army on Earth, an army that could put 1,000 bombers over a city and float a harbor across the English Channel, spent the winter of 1944 depending, at the level of the individual rifleman, on a technology that predates the Roman legions: wool, body heat, and discipline. The trucks could deliver socks to the chow line, but no organization on Earth could reach into the foxhole at midnight and make a freezing, exhausted teenager take his boots off and do the rotation. That last 18 inches of the supply chain ran on nothing but the culture of the rifle squad. Sergeants who checked, buddies who rubbed, men who kept the ritual on the nights they could barely keep their eyes open. The Army provided the wool. The infantry provided the will. Neither worked without the other, and that winter the whole weight of the war in the West came down, nightly, onto pairs of damp socks pressed against the chests of sleeping men. So the next time you see a photograph from that winter, GIs in a snowy foxhole, blanketed, hollow-eyed, waiting, you'll know what you're probably not seeing in the picture. Under those field jackets, against the skin of half the men in the frame, there's a flattened pair of wool socks, slowly drying in the only warm place in Belgium. The rifle kept a man dangerous. The socks kept him there to be dangerous. And the men understood the ranking perfectly, because you could fight the Germans with cold hands, but nobody ever fought them with dead feet. If this history ran in your family, this part of the record belongs to you. Did your father or grandfather talk about the socks, the chest trick, the foot inspections, the buddy rubs, the sock exchange at the chow line? What did he say the cold was like that winter? Put it in the comments. The best story in these comments becomes a future file. If this one was worth your time, leave a like. It pushes these stories in front of more people who grew up hearing them. Share it with someone whose old man never took warm feet for granted again, because this history is too strange and too human to stay buried. And subscribe for more of what they didn't put in the textbooks. To the men who kept the rotation going, night after frozen night, and to the ones whose feet never let them forget that winter, this file was for you.